I have turned on the recording.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Not yet.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. Yeah.
I cannot see it yet. Still, it is blank for me.
I can see Vishal.
I can see it.
Oh, that means something is wrong with my.
Okay, let's start, Jitin. So hi everyone, this is Vikal from Vancouver Meetup Group. Today we will be discussing about Anypoint VPC, VPN, and DLB, and how we can configure it with live demonstration. I have Vishal with me, who is leader for Vancouver Meetup, and Yashwant will be joining late in some time. And we have Jiten Bafna from Capgemini. He will be speaking about this topic. Jiten, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah. So let me. Yeah. So hi everyone. So basically, I'm working as a senior solution architect at a Capgemini, and I'm MuleSoft integration architect and the platform architect, and I'm also a Surat MuleSoft meetup leader. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Can you
Okay.
introduce?
Hi guys, my name is Vishal Agarwal, as Vikalp just introduced. I'm based in Vancouver for 10 years plus. Have been working on integrations for more than 20 years, and last many years, 5-6 years on MuleSoft. And we started this awesome MuleSoft Vancouver chapter last year. So this is our 5th event on MuleSoft, and I would like to welcome you all to this group and to this presentation. We have Jitendra. It's a very core topic, core concept topic of MuleSoft. Today we will be explaining VPC, VPN connectivity, how MuleSoft works in any client environment, while you are doing basically cloud of deployment, how it works, connecting to your on-premises application, etc. So once again, welcome you all, and I hope you take away something from here today. Thank you. Jitendra?
Yeah. So guys, the agendas for today's meetup is like we will going to discuss why MuleSoft is known as a multi-tenant platform, and then we will see what is a VPC, VPN, and dedicated load balancer. Also, we will see why we require a dedicated load balancer, even we have a shared load balancer which is by default enabled on each and every application. Then we will see what are the different use cases for Anypoint VPC, VPN, and the dedicated load balancer. And we will see a 2 live demonstration, one how to create a VPC and how to create a dedicated load balancer basically. Okay, so then finally we will see some references for this particular session.
And also we will have a quiz, right? At the end we will have a quiz. We will be for right answers from the participant, could be in them a voucher, training voucher, or certification voucher from MuleSoft.
Yeah. Okay. So let's try to start with a problem statement, like why we will go with VPC, VPN, and dedicated load balancer. I have one client, he's looking to set up a MuleSoft platform which can connect to a SaaS-based application like Salesforce, NetSuite. When I say SaaS-based, it's like the application which are available publicly and can be accessible over the internet. Okay, and then we have some application which is exist in the AWS. Like I have a SAP system which is in the AWS private subnet basically, which is not accessible publicly. And then I have some resources or some databases on-premise data center. So that is a customer requirement basically. So he want to set up a MuleSoft platform where he have to connect SaaS-based application, where he have to connect a private subnet in the AWS, and like also a on-premise data center. So where it like resources like database and other core resources exist. Also they want to cloud-based solution where they don't want to manage any infrastructure, and all application must be high available and the fault tolerance. An application can access by the fewer client publicly, like no. So this is the basically a requirement from the customer. And also they want features like intelligent healing, like zero downtime updates, those kind of things required for by my one of the customer. So let's see how we can solve this problem basically. Can I go to next slide? So first, try to understand why a MuleSoft is known as a multi-tenant basically. So if you see currently a MuleSoft exists in the 12 AWS region. So in US it's North Virginia, in US it's Ohio, US West it's California, and US West Oregon. Like it have a 3 data centers in EU also, and 3 in Asia Pacific, 1 in Central Canada, and 1 is in South America, Sao Paulo. So generally, MuleSoft is a multi-tenant platform. So first, try to understand what is multi-tenant. So let's consider like you have one big hardware, like it have a lot of resources on the top of this hardware. Like we have a high amount of RAM, we have a high amount of basically memory, all those things. So let's consider if a single tenant or the single client of the cloud vendor is using that machine, right? He will not able to like use all the resources. And also secondly, it might be a very costly for them, to bear like to buy such kind of hardware. So generally in that case, what we does, we create a small virtual machine on that bare metal server or on that particular hardware, right? So and that VMs can be shared across the multiple tenants basically. Those virtual machines can be shared across the multiple tenant, which doesn't mean like data will be flow from one tenant to another tenant. They are isolated from each other, but that particular hardware can be used by multiple tenants basically. Multiple tenant means a client of the cloud vendor. Okay, so that hardware can be used, like in that case what will happen, all the resources can be used effectively, and also the cost will be shared between the multiple tenant basically, right? So it like that particular virtual machine or that particular hardware will be not costly to one tenant, right? The cost will divide it between multiple tenant. Okay, this is the in case of infrastructure as a service. In case of SaaS, like in case of SaaS offering, what does it happen? So we have some software, like we have some software. That particular software is shared across the multiple tenant, right? Like take the Office 365, like take other SaaS service products, like take Anypoint platform itself. So generally that particular application or web application is shared across the multiple tenant, but it doesn't mean the data is shared, right? The data is the isolated. So let's consider, so MuleSoft is generally shared everything in the cloud basically. Like if you see a shared load balancer, if you see platform services, if you see monitoring services are shared across the multiple tenant, right? So that is why a MuleSoft is known as a multi-tenant platform. Also, if you see a cloud worker is a multi-tenant cloud of the virtual machine. So as I mentioned, the first thing, like like when we create a virtual machine, it's like virtual machine we create on the top of some hardware. So one hardware can have multiple virtual machine, right? So like when we deploy the application, MuleSoft application, it get deployed on the AWS EC2 instance. So AWS EC2 instance is nothing, it's a virtual machine. So in my each region, I have some range of IP addresses. Let's consider this is one range, this is second range, this is third range, this is 4 range. So let's consider if I am deploying my application. So what will happen? So MuleSoft will automatically select one of the IP from any ranges. So there are other tenant can be also deploy the application within the same IP ranges basically, correct? So that is why MuleSoft is known as a multi-tenant platform generally. Okay, so let me go to next line. You got it, right? What is a multi-tenant platform? Basically, it's nothing. We are sharing the resources in case of infrastructure as a services. So in case of SaaS, like we are sharing the web application. Let's consider Anypoint platform for the example. Okay, so let me try to make you understand like what is VPC basically, why we create a VPC. So basically Anypoint VPC is nothing, it's a virtual private cloud which allow you to create a isolated network in the cloud where you can easily deploy your application within your isolated network. So what does this mean? If you see in multi-tenant, I have some predefined IP addresses. So what you can do, you can define your own IP addresses, and it will have an extra block which will be containing your IP ranges basically. So generally when we create a VPC, we select a region, in which region I want to create this particular IP ranges. So that particular IP ranges will create it in that particular region, which will, in that case, all the application will be deployed which are belongs to your organization. In that case, the IP ranges will be not shared with the other tenants. Okay. So like generally, as I mentioned, it's allow you to create a logical isolated network within the cloud where you can deploy a Mule runtime, and you can run the Mule runtime with a Mule application basically. Okay, so MuleSoft Cloud Hub is a multi-tenant integration platform or service which we have discussed, and like there are other reasons we create an Anypoint VPC basically. So basically, our problem statement is that like I want to connect some application running in the AWS private network. I want to connect the application which is running in the on-premise data center. So in that case, you have to create the isolated network so you can connect the resources which is available in the private cloud, which is available in your on-premise data center. So there are three techniques which is provided by MuleSoft can be used. One is secure VPN tunnel. Sometimes it is also known as IPsec tunneling. Then we have a VPC peering. Then we have a AWS direct connect. So IPsec tunneling. So basically, when you want to connect your on-premise resources, you always use the VPN IPsec tunneling. What is the VPC peering? Let's consider I have created an Anypoint VPC, right? And I have a AWS, like I have some virtual private cloud in the AWS. To connect both the resources, we can simply use the Anypoint VPC peering basically. So there are some prerequisite for VPC peering. So both the VPC, Anypoint VPC and the AWS VPC must exist in the same region for doing the VPC peering. Generally, if you go to Anypoint platform, you don't have an option to set up a VPC peering. You have to raise the ticket with MuleSoft support team. You have to provide all the details. So there is a discovery template you can find on the MuleSoft document. You have to fill that discovery template and you have to raise the ticket with MuleSoft and they will set up for you. In case of VPN IPsec tunneling, it's a self-service. You can go and set up your own. In case if you don't know how to set up, you can definitely raise the ticket with MuleSoft basically. And AWS Direct Connect, basically it's a bit of faster approach where like in middle we have some like other entity. We are connecting through that entity to the other VPC basically. Okay, and even like if you want to create AWS Direct Connect, you have to create a ticket with a MuleSoft and you have to fill that discovery template. You have to provide it. So let me explain once again why we go for VPC. One, we have to create isolated network in the cloud hub. The secondly, I want to connect an on-premise data center and I want to connect some resources in the private cloud. So we talk about the VPC peering. So generally, when we do the VPC peering, like I have an Anypoint VPC in US East region, US East 1 region, and I have a AWS VPC in US East 1 region. So to peer both, we use the VPC peering. So for VPC peering, we have a condition like both VPC must exist in the same region. In case if my Anypoint VPC and like AWS VPC exist in the different region, you have to do the IPsec tunneling basically. Okay. So let's consider what are the advantages. So one of the advantages of creating a VPC, it creates an isolated network. It doesn't allow other tenant to deploy the application in your IP ranges. Basically, you can deploy your own application in your IP ranges. Okay. So basically, this is also one of the useful when we have to go for IP whitelisting, IP. So basically, there are some application. So generally, what happens in MuleSoft when you deploy the application on the cloud hub, right? Your IP address dynamically change basically, right? So like once you redeploy it, the IP address will change. The application restarted, IP address will change. Yeah, there is an option to enable the static IP address. So generally, like if you have a 2 vCores, you get 2 static IP address. If you have a 4 vCores, you get a 4 static IP address, right? But this VPC is the good solution where like your range of IP address. Even the application will restart, it will take the IP from that particular range, right? So you can whitelist that particular IP range. There are some SaaS application where we want to connect the SaaS application from cloud up, basically, right? So those SaaS application need some IP whitelisting. Like if some MuleSoft is trying to connect that SaaS application, but for that SaaS application requires some IP whitelisting. So you can give this CIDR range, basically this particular subnet or this VPC range to them. Okay. Apart from that, using VPC, you can connect the resources which is behind the firewall, or which is in the private AWS cloud. You can deploy your Mule runtime securely, and as I mentioned, it can connect to any public cloud or private cloud or premise data center securely. What are the use cases for VPC? One of the use cases for the VPC, you want to connect on-premise data center resources and some application running in the private AWS or any cloud. So this is the one of the thing where we have to use a VPC. The other thing, when you want to create a dedicated load balancer, you have to go with a VPC. That is the second, second option. Then apart from that, if you want to make your application running isolated, as I mentioned, in your particular IP ranges, in that case, you go with a Anypoint VPC. There are few characteristics of a VPC. So you can create a multiple VPC in the same region. Okay. So generally always create a VPC in the same region or near to your data center. Let's consider if your on-premise data center or if your AWS resources in US East 1 region. So it is recommended to create a VPC in the US East 1 region. It will reduce a latency when both the VPC or on-premise data center try to connect with the cloud hub. It will reduce the latency. Okay. Apart from that, it is generally recommended to create a separate VPC for production and the separate VPC for non-production. So generally, you can map a multiple environment, multiple environment with a one VPC, even multiple business group with the one VPC, basically. Okay. So generally, it is recommended always create a VPC in the parent business group and then share with the child business group. If you create a VPC in the child business group, it cannot be shared with a parent, basically, right? So it is recommended, but there's it's not hard and fast. You have to always create in the parent business group. You can create in this directly in sub business group, but it is always recommended if you are creating in the parent business group, it can share across the multiple sub business group. Okay. So there are few things for accessing the application VPC, you can use the below URL. So for port 8091, we will discuss about this port. It's HTTP mule worker hyphen internal, then application name dot region dot cloud up 8091. We will discuss this thing. Then port 8092. So generally, we have two ports set up enabled in that firewall within the VPC. We will discuss about this thing. So if you have a 8092, so 8092 means HTTPS mule worker internal, then app name dot region dot cloud up dot io 8092. Okay. So as I mentioned, if you want to create a VPC, VPN, and dedicated load balancer are the self-service. If you don't want to create it, you just fill the discovery template and raise the support ticket. They will do for you, and it take around 3 to 4 days, maybe maybe earlier also. Any question till now? No, right? Okay, so these are the few firewall rules. So I will call this as a default firewall rule. When you create a VPC, there are 4 firewall rules. So basically, the first thing is http.port 8081. So once you have created a VPC and you deploy the application on 8081, so it can be accessible publicly. Basically, that application can be accessible publicly. Okay, using the shared load balancer over the protocol HTTP. When you deploy the application on https.port 8082, again, this particular application can also accessible publicly, but over the protocol HTTPS. So there is a port called http.privateport 8091. When you are deploying the application on the port 8091 within the VPC, right, that application will be not accessible outside the VPC. That application will be only accessible within the VPC, and you have to use this particular URL, http mule worker internal appname.region.cloud 8091. And similarly, https.private.port 8092, the application can be accessible within the VPC over HTTPS. And this is the URL you can use, that https mule worker internal appname.region.cloud 8092. Then you should have a question, if I'm deploying my application right? And I want to access on port 8091 and 8092. How can I can access that application publicly? The solution is dedicated load balancer. We will going to create a dedicated load balancer to access the application which is deployed within the VPC. We will see that. So this is like, we need to understand how we can do the VPC sizing. Okay. So generally you have a four environment. You have a dev, test, SIT, and the production. So generally you have a four environment. So application on dev and SIT must run on the one worker. Application on the test must be run on two worker. Application on the prod must be run on the two workers. Total application equals to 10 in the near future. So the organization will have a two VPC, one for prod and another for non-prod. So generally all non-prod environment will be mapped with a non-prod VPC, dev, test, and SIT, and prod environment will be mapped with a prod VPC. The problem statement is that we need to decide a minimum CIDR block will needed for production and the non-prod VPC. So CIDR means a class interdynamic routing. So generally previously what happening, like, we have a class based IP address. So we have a class A which contain like around 255 IP address. Then we have a class B which contain around 60,000 IP address. We have a class C which contains 65,000 IP address. In case like if I want to deploy 1,000 or 2,000 application, I have to go with a 65,000, a class C kind of IP address range, right? In that case, we can like waste lot of IP addresses. So there's a technique called CIDR. So classless interdynamic routing. So let just understand this few requirement. I have a four environment: dev, test, SIT, and the prod. On dev and SIT, my application must run on one worker. The test must work on two worker. On production must run on two workers. And near future, a total application equals to 10. So generally you have to decide how many application will be in the future, basically. So I've decided 10. So once you decide 10, so always multiply by 10, it will become 100. So MuleSoft suggests always take 10 times more than what, because once you have created a VPC, you cannot change your IP ranges. You have to delete and you have to recreate the VPC. In that case, all application may require a downtime. To avoid those kind of thing, always make sure you select the higher range of CIDR block, basically. So that's why I'm saying, when customer saying I have only 10 application, you always multiply with 10. So it will become 100. So let me do some calculation here. I have a dev, SIT, test, and the production. This is production VPC. This is non-production VPC. As I mentioned, for dev environment, I will deploy application into one worker. For SIT, I will again deploy application on the one worker. So total 100 worker. For test, I will deploy application on two workers. So 200 into 2 become 200 worker. On production, again, I will deploy the application on two worker, which will become 200. So total IP required for the production VPC is 200, and total IP required for non-production, which is 400. And it is always recommended, like always take the 50% of the total IP address for the high availability and the zero downtime. So generally what happens in MuleSoft, like it take a zero downtime updates. So generally you deploy the application, right? When you try to modify or update the application, it doesn't remove the older version of your application. It keep the older version of application as it is. It's keep running. Once the new or modified version get uploaded, it will like point a domain from older application to new application, and it will remove the older application. Okay, so it requires some IP address for that. Then total IP address required for the production VPC is 300, and non-production VPC we require 600. So 200 plus 100, 300. 400 plus 200 is 600. So there are two IP address which is always reserved for the infrastructure for network and the broadcasting purpose. So we require 302 IP address in the production and 602 IP address in the non-production. So let me open and let me show you. So 0/24 and 0/23, 0/22. It goes up to 0/16. For 0/24, it give me a 256 IP address or 256 host. It will give me a 512 host. It will give me a 1024. Okay, and it go up to 0/16, which will give me 65536 IP address. So now my requirement is I require 302 IP address for production, which fit in this particular mask 0/22, 0/23. Whereas for non-production, I require 602 IP address, which fits under the 0/22. Okay, so these are the IP range I will going to select for my particular requirement. Okay, so let me share my screen again. You got this. So this minimum support by MuleSoft is 0/24, and maximum support by MuleSoft, which is 0/16. Okay, so it goes up to start from 0/24, which gives 256 IP address, and 0/16 gives 65,536 IP addresses. So in my case for production, I need 302 IP address, which doesn't falls under 0/24. It falls under 512. On non-production, I require 602 IP addresses, which doesn't fall under 0/23, which falls under 0/22. So that is how you do the VPC sizing. Okay.
We have one question in the chat window.
Let me check. Yeah, as I mentioned, Venkata, you can definitely take that. A class C is which is contains 65,536. So most of the client is not doing VPC sizing. They are directly taking 0/16. Now it's depend on your organization, what kind of IP range is available with your organization, right? So that you can definitely take that, So no, it doesn't cost it, but it will, like, your IP address will be wasted. Like, it doesn't cost, Venkata. Your number of IP address will be wasted, right? You can utilize those IP ranges at somewhere else, basically. That's the reason. Okay. I will go back to presentation. And also, like, one important thing I forget to give you. So once you have calculate your mask, basically, right, you have to ensure that whatever IP ranges you are giving, that is not matching with your on-premise environment, basically with your on-premise data center. You have to give a unique. So basically what will happen once you create a VPN, your cloud hub will be part your cloud hub will be part of your on-premise data center only, right? So if you are giving the IP ranges which is already available in your on-premise data center with some other application, so what will happen, there might be clashing of the IP addresses, right? So always give the unique IP range, basically. So in that case, as I mentioned, I will use the 0/23 mask, which is 192.168.0.0/23, which give 512 IP address, and 192.168.0/22, which give me a 1024 IP addresses. So that is how we do the VPC sizing. Yeah, some of the customer, I told you, like, they directly take 0/16 if they are not aware like how many application in future. And there are customer, they have like around 10, 100 APIs, 200 APIs, 500 APIs. They don't know, like, in future what will happen. So they directly go with 0/16. You cannot go below or like above 0/16, basically. Okay. So VPC sizing best practice: always create a VPC in same region which we have discussed, close to your data center. The good thing, like, always you need to choose a higher and the appropriate range of CIDR mask, because once you have created a VPC, you have assigned a CIDR mask to that VPC. You cannot delete that. You cannot delete or you cannot, sorry, you cannot update that CIDR mask again. In that case, you have to delete and you have to recreate the VPC. So once you delete and recreate the VPC, you have to make sure you restart all the applications also. Okay, always choose a CIDR match which doesn't overlap with your data center IP address. As I mentioned, like, you choose that a CIDR match which doesn't overlap with your on-premise data center. And I already gave the reason why. Okay, always it is good practice. It doesn't mean like you can create a same VPC for production and non-production environment, but generally try to keep it a separate entity, basically. Both non-production and the production VPC is a separate entity. Always create a VPC in the parent business group so you can share easily with the other child business group, basically. But there's a no hard and fast rule where you cannot create a VPC directly in child business group. You can do that also. Okay, so typically this is the how the architecture will look like. I will have a prod VPC where I have deployed some application. I will have a non-prod VPC where I have a dev and test environment. So they will also take the IP from these particular ranges. And like then I have extend my cloud hub to connect on-premise data center using VPN IPsec tunneling, basically. So this is how a typical Anypoint VPC architecture will look like. So we have already discussed, like, how. So basically, if your application deployed over the port 8081 and 8082, okay, So as per firewall rule, it can be accessible publicly. So these are the simple, appname.region.cloudhub.io or https appname.region.cloudhub.io. This is nothing. This is the shared load balancer URL. So basically, in case if you deploy application on 8091 and 8092, those application cannot be accessible over the internet directly. Those can be accessible over the on-premise data center if you create a VPN IPsec internally, or can be accessible within the VPC, not outside the VPC. Okay. So to access those application out which is deployed within the VPC, we will going to see a dedicated load balancer basically. Okay, so this is how the application can be accessed which is deployed over the VPC. This is my shared load balancer. So basically this is the internet, and like I have a HTTP, and you give the app name .region.cloudhub.io, then the request come to shared load balancer. This is the default TCP load balancer provided by MuleSoft, and this is the shared load balancer. Why we call this as a shared load balancer? At initial I told you, like, we have a multi-tenant, MuleSoft is a multi-tenant platform, so generally they share the load balancer also. Okay, then it forward the traffic to mule worker appname.region.cloudhub.io. So once we get a request, so load balancer will send the request to this particular DNS. So generally this is mule worker application name.region.port, then it will come to this firewall rule within the VPC, and VPC say 8081 is allowed, then it will directly access the application. Okay, if I want to access the application within the internal network, I can use the mule worker internal appname.region.cloudhub.io and the port 8081 or port 8082. So that is how you can access your application from the corporate office basically. Okay, we will discuss this slide later. Let me discuss now only. So generally I have deployed my application on port 8091 and 8092, and I want to access those applications over the internet. So you have a concept called like dedicated load balancer. So internet will send the request to the dedicated load balancer. Dedicated load balancer will apply the dedicated load balancer mapping rule, send the request to mule worker internal -appname.region.cloudhub.io. I will discuss this 8091, 8092, and then the app name. It will check for firewall rule and it will access the application. So you can directly access from corporate network using. So generally when you create a dedicated load balancer, it gives two CNAME. One is external CNAME and one is internal CNAME. So from once you have created a VPN IPsec externally, you can directly access the application using the internal load balancer, dedicated load balancer. We will discuss this. Let me go with to Anypoint management center. So if you go to runtime manager, you have an option VPC. So you can directly create a VPC here. So first thing, you have to provide a VPC name. I will say mule demo VPC. You have to select the region. You have to give a CIDR block. So I can give 10.0.1.0/24. You have to select the environment. So in my case, I have only one environment. I can say production. I have a one business group. It will take by default. Okay. So these are the settings you just need to do for creation of the VPC, and you simply say create VPC.
In the chat window.
Yeah, let me take it. Yes, yeah, this is the good question. Even you deploy your application on port 8081 and port 8082, that application is running the in VPC only. But what what firewall we have allowed, that if you deploy an application on port 8081 and 8082, it is accessible anywhere. So by default, it will be accessible on subnet mask 0.0.0.0/0, which means this can be accessible from anywhere. I will show that demo right now, once my VPC is configured. So you can see I have created my VPC. You can check the firewall rules. So by default, there are 4 firewall rules. If you see 8081 and port 8082, in that case, it is accessible on anywhere 0.0.0.0/0. If you deploy application on port 8091 and 8092, it is only accessible within your VPC. Okay. So let me show you some demonstration. So right now I have a two application. Okay, so let me do one. Let me check the IP address for this particular application. If I want to check IP address for this particular IP application, you can simply go to I will just open my notepad. I will say mule worker. You can say internal and app name. So app name, this is app name dot region the cloud.io. So this is how you can use that, and you can go to command prompt. You can simply say ping, or you can say ns lookup. So if you see, still it haven't take the IP addresses from your VPC, right? Because I have deployed this application before creating the VPC. Now I want to bring those application within the VPC. How can I do that? Does anybody knows that? If I want to find external IP address for your application, you just remove this internal, okay, and copy this. You can simply say ping. This is the external IP address, right? So generally, does anybody knows, like, what? Now I have some application already deployed. I want to bring those application into the VPC. How can I do? Yeah.
There are network tooling available. We can deploy network tools and ping and trace out different network commands using that network tooling available from Mule website.
Yeah, see, it's a network tool basically, right? That why we use that net tool. So net tool is come into picture, like, when you are creating the VPN. So if you want to test some, like, you can do ping, you can do, some other thing like socket connection, like you can do tracer. Like if you want to do some debugging, like when you create a VPN, you are not able to connect your on-premise resources. You can use that net tool for debugging. But my question is that, see, I have a two application which is already deployed. After that, I have created the VPC. Now I want to bring those application into the VPC. What can we do? So generally it's nothing, like we can restart those applications. Right now, if you see, what is the internal IP address for this application, which is 172.16.38.51. But my my IP range is 10.0.1.0/24. So it should take the IP address from this particular range. So as soon as I will restart, it will do that. So let me restart. Let me restart both the application. So I have one application deployed on 8081 and 8091 basically. So let's go with dedicated load balancer till application is restarting. So dedicated load balancer is nothing. It's an optional component. Like, it's not a mandatory component in your MuleSoft ecosystem basically. Yeah, like if you want to, like, access the application which is deployed within the VPC publicly, right? In that case, you can go with a dedicated load balancer. So generally, what does dedicated load balancer does? So generally, we create a dedicated load balancer within the same VPC, right? So if you are creating something within the same VPC, it can access those applications. So generally what happens when we create a dedicated load balancer, it give a public CNAME basically. That public CNAME can be used to access your application deployed within the VPC. So generally, if you see, a dedicated load balancer is the optional component in the Anypoint platform, which allows to route the traffic or external traffic to or external HTTPS traffic to multiple application deployed to the cloud of within the VPC. So generally, dedicated load balancer is capable of accepting the external traffic and apply a mapping rule and transfer the traffic to the right application deployed into your runtime manager. Okay, so generally, if you create a dedicated load balancer, it give a two DNS. One is external DNS, one is internal DNS. So lb name dot lb, so whatever dedicated load balancer name you give, dot lb dot anypoint dns dot net. And similarly, lb name hyphen internal lb dot anypoint dns dot net, it is for internal access within the VPC. Okay, so generally, dedicated load balancer is by default, it's a high available. So generally, you create a two instance of your dedicated load balancer, which is running on worker 1 and the worker 2, right? So you create multiple instances. So it ensures that at least dedicated load balancer is a high available. It resolves to two public IP addresses. If you see, this is the typical architecture of dedicated load balancer. The client will send a request to the dedicated load balancer, which is running within the VPC. Dedicated load balancer will see like transfer the traffic. If it's HTTP, it will use port 8091. If it is HTTPS, it will use port 8092 and transfer the traffic to the environment. We will see this mapping rule. How does it happens? Then finally, what we have to do, you want to define some your public domain, basically api.dev example.com, api.test example.com. You can map with in public register. You can do generally don't map between public domain and IP address. I will suggest always map between a public domain and the CNAME, basically, because the IP address, if you are if you are not using the static IP address, right, in that case IP address keep on changing, but your name will not never change, right? So you always do the mapping between this particular domain and the CNAME in the public DNS registry, basically. Let me check if my application is deployed. It's still updating. Okay. So let's understand what is a difference between dedicated load balancer and a shared load balancer. So generally, by default, when you deploy your application, MuleSoft provide a shared load balancer which is shared across the multiple tenant. And like generally, the shared load balancer is something like that: appname.region.cloudup.io. Okay. Shared load balancer doesn't allow to configure any custom SSL certificate. Okay. Apart from that, shared load balancer have some rate limiting. Exactly nobody knows how much request can come in one second, but there are some rate limiting setup on your shared load balancer. So generally it keep on changing, depending on the number of depending on the traffic, it keep on changing that rate limiting. Generally, in case your quota is completed, it will give 503 server unavailable. And also each application will be have a different domain, basically, right? If you see, if you're deploying application with xyz name, so it will say xyz dot cloudup.io. If you're saying abc dot cloudup.io, but at the enterprise level these things doesn't work, right? So we go for dedicated load balancer. So in dedicated load balancer, there is a no rate limiting. Generally, you can set up a rate limiting on your application by using the API policies or API manager, but generally there is a no rate limiting by default on the dedicated load balancer. All application can be hosted within the single domain. If you want to host all the application within the single domain, you go with dedicated load balancer. It also support two-way SSL authentication and handle the load balancing among the different cloud hub workers that run your application. Okay, we will discuss about these points also. Let me check if my application is deployed. Yeah, it's deployed. Let me check what is the IP range now. You can see now for your Mule internal worker, IP has been taken as a 10.0.1.50, which belongs to your VPC. So let me try to access this application 8081. I think it should easily accessible. This is also deployed within the VPC. I can say HTTP. You got the response? Okay. You can say you can say response from 8081 application. Now let me try to access 8091. It will give 502 bad gateway. Okay, we cannot access that application publicly, basically. Let's see how we will going to access this application soon. So generally, when you create a dedicated load balancer, we have an option called HTTP inbound mode. So generally, there are three options: off, on, and the redirect. So off means it will always allow a traffic on the HTTPS, and it does SSL offloading and the send the request to the upstream API on HTTP, basically. So generally, from outside, we get a request on HTTPS, right? Then it do SSL offloading and then send the request to the application deployed within the cloud hub over the protocol HTTP on. So once you done the on, it will accept. accept the request on default SSL endpoint using the HTTP protocol. What does this mean? So basically, you can receive the traffic on HTTP protocol, not HTTPS, HTTP protocol. It receives the traffic on HTTP protocol and send the traffic to upstream API on HTTP. Redirect. You receive the traffic on HTTPS and redirect the traffic on HTTPS to upstream API basically. There are other configuration. By default, the IP address assigned to dedicated load balancer is the static IP address. If you want dynamic, you can disable this. Disable static IPs specify to use the dynamic address. If you want to keep this percentage 23 character as is, percentage 20 character as is, so you can use up this keep URL encoding option. If you want to support TLS 1.0 between client and DLB, you can enable this option. If you want to enable like TLS 1.2, you can enable this particular option. There are options available. Okay. So let me so these are some like generally for creating dedicated load balancer we at least require one certificate. Okay, so generally like configure the SSL certificate to enable the HTTPS. So generally if you want to enable the HTTPS endpoint, or like even by default you cannot create a dedicated load balancer without implementing a certificate on the dedicated load balancer. At least you require one private key and the one public key associated with your dedicated load balancer. So generally you can use the OpenSSL utility for generating the self-signed certificate. It is not recommended to use the self-signed certificate. Always sign a certificate which is which is signed by CEO authority basically. Okay, so generally like what will happen if there's a no hard and fast rule where you cannot use a self-signed certificate, but they are a bit insecure and a lot of browsers doesn't recognize a self-signed certificate. You get an option like your connection is a private, all those kind of thing, right? So generally you can avoid that, using the self-signed certificate. But for demo, we will going to use the self-signed certificate. So this is the command open SSL request. This command you can use that, for generating. Okay. Also, dedicated load balancer support you can support multiple DNS basically. You can map multiple domains with one single dedicated load balancer. So generally you can also create a config file, like that. You can say what is the country you require, like all these parameter you can configure, and what are the DNS needs to be support API dev, API code example.com, and you can again use this particular open SSL utility basically. Also, sometime dedicated load balancer also support a wildcard certificate like star.example.com. You don't know what is your subdomain, right? In the place, you don't know what is your subdomain. You can have any subdomain. In that case, you can go with star.example.com. This is the wildcard certificate. You can easily create this config file and you can run this particular open SSL command again. Okay. Let me understand let me make you understand what is a dedicated load balancer mapping rule. So let's consider when I'm getting the request on my dedicated load balancer, how dedicated load balancer will come to know where I have to transfer my request basically, right? Dedicated load balancer doesn't know that. So there should be some criteria, there should be some condition, there should be something which can like ensure that the request is transferring to the right application or to the right URI. So where a dedicated load balancer mapping rules comes into picture. So if you see, mapping rules are used on the dedicated load balancer to translate input URL to call the application deployed on the cloud hub. So generally, if you let consider my input path, this is the curly bracket, whatever I define in the curly bracket, that is the app basic, that is the variable. So basically I'm saying like slash curly bracket app slash app. So this is the input request. Then my target app will be curly bracket app, and then what is the protocol, which is HTTP. I will show that example with demonstration. Then again, my input path is app. Sometime what happens, so one dedicated load balancer is mapped with multiple environments, so you will have a multiple DNS. So how you can transfer the request? So that is where a subdomain come into picture. The subdomain I will show. Let's consider what is subdomain. Let's try to understand the subdomain first. So generally if I'm saying API dev.example.com, so subdomain will be API dev. If I'm saying API test.example.com, my subdomain will be API test. So this is my subdomain basically. Okay. So let me explain these rules with the better examples. Yeah. So this is the where I will explain. So generally what happens, so basically my request will come on api.example.com, which is mapped with this particular dedicated load balancer CNAME. So I'm saying http api.example.com/order API. See, order API is nothing, it's a app, So basically this is the app variable. Okay. App version 1.0 orders. So generally I got this request. Dedicated load balancer will apply this rule: input path, which is app, target application, which is curly bracket under app, output path slash, I don't have anything in output, protocol HTTP. So it will convert this particular URL into like, basically HTTP order API, order API dot us east one. So generally us east one dot cloudup.io. So generally, I don't think this is right. We forget. So let me show you what it will does. So let's consider I am getting the request on this HTTP. Let me check what is that. Yeah, API dot example.com/order API. Okay, slash version 1.0/orders. So as per mapping rule, what it does, it will say, so it will be HTTPS. Okay, it does SSL offloading, and it will form URL like this: HTTP mule worker internal. Okay? Then it will give app name. So what is my app name? So generally app name will be the order API, right? So this is my variable declare. So my app name will be the order API dot, it will give a region US East 1 dot cloudhub.io. Then it will say version 1.0/order. So that is how dedicated load balancer will translate the URL depending on the mapping rule and transfer the request to the VPC, and it will call the application deployed with the VPC using this particular URL. Don't forget to put port 8091. So that is how it do the translation. Okay, so let me go with some complex rule. This is a simple one. Let me explain with one complex rule. Okay, so in case of complex rule, what will happen, like I have one dedicated load balancer which is mapped with dev environment and the test environment. In external, I have something called dev.api.example. For development environment, the customer will send the request in this particular URL. For test environment, the customer will send the URL request on this test.example.com. So now what will happen, so they both are mapped with the same dedicated load balancer. So now my request come on http dev.api.example order API version 1.0/I order. So in this case, if you see the mapping rule, input part is app, target app, curly bracket app, and curly bracket subdomain. Subdomain will be dev in this case. So my application deployed on the dev environment is order API, order hyphen API hyphen dev. So my URL will, app will be order hyphen API hyphen subdomain will be dev, right? So let me explain with some other example. Let me go back to notepad. So I am saying dev.api.com. In that case, my rule, my target app is something called this app hyphen subdomain basically, right? So in this case, my this application name will become order API hyphen dev, right? This is in case of dev.api.example.com. In case of it, if my subdomain is test, right? The subdomain will change to test basically. Let's consider if it's a production, right? I will not send any subdomain, right? So it will be like this: order API test. So that is how it execute these rules basically. So let me tell you, so that is how it dynamically execute the rule and transfer the request to right environment. So yeah. Okay, so that is how, like, this subdomain is very important when you are like dedicated load balancer is mapped with multiple environment, right? In that case, you can use make use of subdomain to route the request to correct environment basically. Okay. There's other thing, dedicated load balancer whitelisted CID. By default, all the external traffic has been allowed on the dedicated load balancer. But because if you see, by default, the CID is 0.0.0.0.0/0. But if you want to allow a traffic from some specific IP ranges, right? You can remove this 0.0.0.0 and you can just mention that specific IP ranges here. So it will drop all the other traffic. It will just allow the traffic from those IP ranges basically. Okay. So let me go with dedicated load balancer demonstration. Any question? Okay, see, why certificates? Sometimes what happens, the certificates contain that your DNS domain names, right? So whenever the request is coming, so your domain name needs to be verified somewhere, right? So so that is the place where the certificates come into picture. If you are sending some invalid domain, like if you on in your certificate, the domain allowed is dev.example.com, so it will only allow dev.example.com. Like, if it's coming like prod.example. It will drop those requests if it's not allowed in the dedicated load balancer. Okay, so you that is how we require a certificates. And also, like, for SSL handshake between your client and the dedicated load balancer, you require a certificate, right? Otherwise, like, anybody can access the HTTPS endpoint. So HTTPS means you want a certificate, so where the client can ensure that it is sending the request to the right server basically, right? It does a handshake with them. So that's why we require the certificate. Without certificate, it is not able to do the handshake basically. Okay, let me go to Anypoint platform. Okay, it's expired. So now I can go to a load balancer. Okay, I can say create a load balancer. I can say mule demo DLB. You can select your VPC, in which VPC I want to create a dedicated load balancer. So by default, a timeout between a dedicated load balancer and an upstream API is 300. I will keep HTTP inbound mode is equals to op. So I will accept a traffic on HTTPS and redirect traffic on HTTP. I will not going to use any of these options. Add certificates. I want a public key and a private key. So let me generate a public key and the private key. I have this command with me. Okay. I will copy this command and I have OpenSSL utility. Okay. So let me just execute this command. So country name, I can give state, I can give image. I can give localhost for now because I'm not testing any DNS because I have to do some public DNS registry. So I can avoid that for now. Your certificate has been created. If you see in certificates folder, it will create a public key and a private key basically. Okay. So let me go back to my dedicated load balancer. You can choose a public key. Yeah, this is public CRT. Then you can choose a private key within the same location, test private. Okay. Then by default, if you see, there's a one mapping rule. Okay, we will not going to change anything. We will keep save. So each certificate is associated with some mapping rule basically. Okay. Save certificate. Then I will say create a load balancer. It's very simple to create load balancer basically. You can select up to 5 worker in your load, up to 8 worker, I think, right? Yeah, 8 worker. So it is creating your dedicated load balancer and starting it. Till now, any question? So I can take it till the.
Yes, we are good.
Okay. Okay, your dedicated load balancer has been started. Okay, so now if you see, go back to a dedicated load balancer. If you see, your dedicated load balancer is mapped with this to public IP address. Let me copy this URL. This is my DC name, which has been created by a dedicated load balancer. I will try to ping this. So it will get resolved to one of the IP address, 34 dot something like, Now I want to access the application which is deployed on the port 8091. Let me try it. HTTPS. Then what is my VPC application name, which is deployed on 8091? I'm trying to access this application. Here I will give my application name, app name slash, I think it's test. Okay. So now I want to access this application. Why I saying don't use the self-signed certificate, because we can get this kind of errors. Then I can say proceed to mule demo. So you can see you got the proper response now. So you can access the application deployed on port 8091 using the dedicated load balancer. Let me open this. You can see a response from application 8091, right? So that is where a dedicated load balancer is very important. There are few things you need to keep in the mind. So let's consider if you have created a VPC in US East 1 region, your application must be also deployed in the US East 1 region. If you are deploying your application in US East 2 region, it will be not deployed within the VPC. It will be deployed a separate in some AWS IP ranges. Okay, so generally this is very important. Your VPC and deployed application must be in the same region. By default, for dedicated load balancer, we don't select the region. Whatever the VPC region, dedicated load balancer will take that particular region. Okay, so these are the two important demo. Let me go with, still we haven't solved our initial problem statement basically, right? We need to solve that. So I will tell you. The first, let me explain what is a VPN. So basically VPN is nothing, it's a virtual private network. So basically it is used to connect the resources which is running in your private cloud or in your on-premise data center from the cloud up. So basically it uses the IPsec tunneling. Okay, and like if you see, like the speed of this particular VPN will around 100 and 125 Gbps GB per second. It can transfer data from on-premise to cloud up to 1.25 GB per second basically. So it's very fast, or each MuleSoft VPC can support up to 10 VPN. So basically you can create up to 10 VPN which is associated with a single VPC. In case if you want to create a 11th, so you have to create a different VPC and create the 11th VPN connection. Generally, when we create a VPN, it support a two kind of routing. One is the dynamic routing and one is the static routing. So dynamic routing use the border gateway protocol. So I will tell you very important. And static routing, it require to define the subnet in your network that are accessible through the Anypoint VPN. So if you see, like generally static routing is used for smaller network and dynamic routing used for the bigger and the very complex network. Static routing is highly secure, whereas dynamic routing is less secure. Okay, and like static routing doesn't follow any specific protocol, whereas dynamic routing mostly follow a BGP protocol. Dynamic routing use because dynamic routing use the complex algorithm to find a shortest path to reach your subnet, whereas static routing doesn't use any complex routing. Let me show with this example. Let me tell you with some example. So what happens with static routing? So generally, let's consider for your on premise, you have a subnet 1, you have a subnet 2, you have a subnet 3. What you do when you create Anypoint VPN, you want to connect the resources in subnet 1, subnet 2, and subnet 3. He will give all these three subnets in your Anypoint VPN basically, right? Let's consider in future if the fourth subnet is coming, right? What you have to do, you have to you have to connect that fourth subnet from your Anypoint VPN. So you have to provide the IP range of that fourth subnet into Anypoint VPN. That has to be done manually. Basically, every time if new subnet is getting added and you want to access those resources, you want to add those static route in your Anypoint VPN. In case of BGP or dynamic routing, you don't have to do, because they are communicating on autonomous system number. So basically we have to specify ASN number. So even in case any new subnet get added into your network, right? So you don't have to specify anything. It will automatically communicate with the new subnets also. The Anypoint VPN will automatically communicate with the new subnet. You don't want to restart, you don't have to do anything, right? That's why we mentioned like it used for the complex network. In complex network, you might not be knowing all the subnets. And in complex network, every day there are some few subnets get added, few subnets get removed, right? So in that case, this particular BGP is very useful, like where we don't communicate directly on the subnet. We communicate via autonomous system number or via BGP protocol. So VPN IPsec tunneling, basically you use this particular generally it is done with on-premise data center. Generally your cloud of VPC is on this particular range and your on-premise is on this range. You can set up IPsec tunnel between both the data, both cloud hub and your on-premise data center. I told you VPC peering, like I have a AWS private VPC and Anypoint VPC. I want to communicate. They both are in US East 1 region. The both has to be communicated. You can simply use the VPC peering. You can raise the ticket with MuleSoft and they will set up a VPC peering for you. Basically, you don't have a VPC peering is not a self-service. You have to 100% raise the ticket with MuleSoft. So generally, let me show you something. Like I don't have a demo for that, but I will try to clear some points. So you can go to VPN. You can say create VPN. Let you explore some option. I will give some demo VPN. You can select a VPC. Here you can give a VPN IP, VPN range, not range. You have to give a VPN IP address. Okay, VPN, a remote VPN IP address. If you see this diagram, you have to give this. So there is an IP address for your VPN device. So you have to give that. While configuring, you have to provide that VPN. So you can ask your infra team to provide that. I'm just giving some 12. So basically, as I mentioned, like static and BGP. In static, you have to always add a new subnet mask, right? So let's consider I add 192.168.1.0/24. And in future, if I want to just you create a VPC, you want to add some new subnet also, 44.56.78.90.23, like that. Okay. Whereas automatic, you can simply say automatic, you can give some local 64512. Okay, let me give some. Must be in range. So basically, either you can say tunnel configuration automatically, or you can say custom. Generally, we define two tunnel. PSK is nothing a pre-shared key. So basically, it's a password for a tunnel 0 and tunnel 1, and you have to give a point-to-point CIDR. So generally, when I say point-to-point CIDR, so these are the CIDR block doesn't support 169.254.0/31.0. You should not give this. So you can give 169.255.6.0/30, 169.7.0/30. So generally, what I will do for my tunnel 1, I can give some config, like some preset secret key. Same thing, like I can give some preset secret key, and then I can give a point-to-point CIDR mask. So generally, I can say something like this. I can copy this, but 5.0 is not supported. So you can say something like 7.0. You can say Control V and say 9.0, like that, and you can simply click on the create VPN. Once you click on the create VPN, it will create both the VPN. Okay. So the other way is BGP. It's very simple, where you have to give a remote autonomous system number. You don't define a static routes here. You just provide It's generally 65001, and your local ASN, this is the MuleSoft. You can keep this as a 64512. There is some range supported for this ASN, which starting from some value to, I will tell you. Then again, here you also can define a automatic and the custom. Like as I mentioned, here you don't define any subnets, right? You simply communicate over this particular local autonomous system number, right? You don't have to create anything. So once you create a VPN, so you will get one option to select your device, basically like your on-premise because once you create a VPN, you have to do some configuration on your on-premise device also. So generally you will get one option where you can generate a file. Basically you select your device, so if it's Cisco, it's a Palo Alto, whatever, and what is the version of your device, you select that, and you can download a config file and share with your on-premise data center network team, basically, and they can configure that file on the VPN device, and it will enable a communication between your cloud of VPN and the on-premise VPN. Generally, a tunnel 0, tunnel 1 can work in active mode and also can work in active passive mode, basically. So generally, you can sometimes it depend on your on-premise VPN device. Either both tunnel can be active, or one tunnel can be active or one tunnel can be passive, basically. Okay. Let me go back to next slide. So by default, these are the few status. So pending down. So basically your VPN connection has been created, action pending in the background. When I say action pending in the background, you have to download that particular file. Okay, the VPN config file, and give it to your on-premise network team, so they can configure, which will make sure tunnel 0 and tunnel 2. So now it's available. So basically it means VPN is successfully created and remote side is not configured. So VPN has been created and your remote side has to be configured. So that file is not configured yet. Available up or up down. In case active, you will see up. In case active passive, you will see one tunnel is up, one tunnel is down. So your VPN is created successfully and remote connection is also successfully configured on your on-premise VPN. Fail down. Something you have done something wrong while creating your VPN, basically. You need to delete and recreate it. These are the few status. Now let me go back to my problem statement. So what was my problem statement? I want to connect SaaS application like Salesforce application in private AWS SAP system on-premise data center like database and the core resources. They want a cloud-based solution where like they don't want to manage a customer because it's a mid-sized company and they don't have a good infrastructure team. They don't want to set up or manage any platform like it should auto heal or auto recover, those kind of requirement. Apart from it must be highly available and the fault tolerance, and application can be accessed by the fewer client matlab few clients, basically. Okay, so let me go back to this solution. We have discussed everything. Now we will have a solution for that. This is the solution. So what we have done, basically, we have created a VPC for prod and the non-production. So basically for non-production, we have a two environment. We have created a VPC in US East 1 and the US East 1. We have created the VPC. Okay. And apart from that, like for connecting my on-premises resources, I have set up a VPN IPsec tunneling, between your VPC and on-premise data center. For production, we have a separate VPN IPsec tunneling. For non-production, I have a separate VPN IPsec tunneling. For connecting the resources in AWS private VPC, I've used the VPC peering. So generally for non-production and the production, I create the VPC between AWS cloud AWS VPC and the Anypoint VPC. So, and they both are in the same region, US East 1, US East 1. For connecting SaaS-based application, we don't have to do anything. So they can directly connect any internet-facing application. It's direct, no? So they can directly connect Salesforce, NetSuite databases without any configuration. And now there might be question people ask a lot of time, like how API manager work in this particular ecosystem, right? It's work in the same way. The request will always come to dedicated load balancer. Dedicated load balancer will apply the mapping rule, then transfer the request to the application. Before that, if application have a API proxy, so dedicated load balancer will transfer the request to API proxy. If application is enabled with API auto discovery, the request will get transferred to the application. Then it will validate all the policies and everything. If anything get failed, the response will go back to the dedicated load balancer which say 401 unauthorized, and the same response will send back to the client. So always make sure dedicated load balancer runs first, then request goes to application or the proxy, then API manager come into the picture. Okay. So any doubt on this particular solution? Finally, we have completed this particular solution basically, So initially we told like we have these are the resources we need to connect here and there. So here, this is the single architecture which is doing everything like VPC to VPC tunneling, VPC peering, and the public internet facing. Also, we have a API and manager enabled on the top of your, VPC and non-prod VPC. So this is the final how the architecture looks like, So if your application deployed on 8081 and 8082, so you can directly access using mule worker appname.cloudup.io port. Then it will transfer the request and it will directly access the application. So it can be accessed via shared load balancer. If your application deployed on 8091 and 8092, you have to create a dedicated load balancer. Request come to dedicated load balancer, and like dedicated load balancer will apply the mapping rule. Once mapping rule apply the mapping rule, then it will transfer the request to firewall. Firewall we validate 8091, 8092, and it will access the worker. Okay, so that is how you can set up your VPC, VPN, and the dedicated load balancer. Yeah, so I am completed with my session on this Anypoint VPC, VPN, and the dedicated load balancer. If you have any specific question, you can ask me. Yeah. So generally, like recommended is always more than one. So by default, it's 2. You can go with higher also. So I think it depends on your load basically, what kind of load you are getting. Yeah. It depends on the load. Like